Okay, the next video in this chapter is going to focus on the exchange of nutrients and molecules that happens in the capillaries. We've talked about that the capillaries is kind of where all of the exchange happens. Not necessarily all, some happens in the veins, but the capillaries by far is the most important. So the most important blood in the body is in the capillaries. It is here through those capillary walls that the exchanges are made. The blood is dropping off important molecules that the tissues need, and then the tissues are releasing waste, and that's going into the capillaries to be disposed of. So capillary exchange is two-way movement of fluid. So some molecules are going into the tissues, other molecules are going back into the blood. Some of the molecules that we're talking about are water, oxygen, glucose, of course, amino acids, which are the monomers of proteins, lipids, and carbon dioxide, hormones as well, and then other wastes. So chemicals can go through, and again, they're using chemicals. I probably would use the word molecule, but pass through the capillary wall three different routes. They can go straight through the endothelial cell cytoplasm. They can fit through those intercellular clefts between the cells. They're kind of little gaps, if you will. Or they can go through the pores in the fenestrated capillaries that we talked about previously. So some of the mechanisms involved or the processes by which these chemicals move through cells or in between cells are diffusion, transcytosis, filtration, and reabsorption. We're going to focus on each of those. So diffusion is the most important form of capillary exchange. It is, I would say, the easiest way that molecules can diffuse or go into the tissues from the capillaries and vice versa. So just to recap, diffusion is a movement from an area of high concentration to a low concentration, and it can move across the cell membrane without any energy being needed. So some examples of diffusion that occur in the capillary beds would be glucose and oxygen. They're more concentrated in the blood, and so they diffuse from the capillary into the tissue. And then carbon dioxide and other wastes are more concentrated in the tissues, and so then they diffuse into the capillary. So again, going from high concentration to low concentration. Capillary diffusion can only happen if the solute, and again, I'm going to use the word molecule because it's my favorite, can permeate through the cell membrane of the cell. So we've talked about that the cell membrane, or you've talked about before me, that the cell membrane is picky about what can cross over the cell membrane. And so glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, they're able to, certain types of cells, they are able to move across that cell membrane. Or if it's a larger molecule, they may need to find a passage. So usually we're talking about the pores or those intercellular clefts in between cells to pass through. So this talks about what molecules are able to easily diffuse hormones, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. They are small, they are lipid soluble, which means they can just move through that cell membrane. And then water soluble substances, and also glucose is larger. So glucose and electrolytes have to go through those pores or the intercellular clefts. And then there's even larger proteins or larger particles that don't diffuse. So proteins would be an example of those. Okay, the next type of movement from the capillaries is called transcytosis. We've talked about exocytosis, endocytosis, pinocytosis, and so this is kind of one more type of movement. And what happens here is that endothelial cells pick up material on one side of the plasma membrane by pinocytosis or endocytosis. Remember, that's where the cell membrane kind of wraps around the particle or the molecule and kind of pulls it in. And that's inside a vesicle at that point. So once the particle is pulled in, it's in a vesicle, it moves across the cell, and then basically goes through exocytosis on the other side of the cell. So this is a fancy way of saying comes into one side of the cell by endocytosis and then out the other side of the cell by exocytosis. So it goes across the cell. Fatty acids, albumin, which is a protein, and some hormones, including insulin, are transported this way. Okay, next we're going to talk about filtration and reabsorption. And so we kind of have to keep in mind the capillary and that where the flow of blood, if you want to think about it that way. So we are starting at the arterial end of the capillary and then moving through the capillary and then kind of drains into the vein at the end. And so this process is kind of a flow of blood. And so that delivers materials to the cell and removes waste. And so that flow does have some opposing forces. So one is blood hydrostatic pressure. That's what drives the fluid out of the capillary, so it doesn't really get stuck. So it's high at the arterial end, but then lower at the venous end. And then another is called colloid osmotic pressure, and it pulls the fluid into the capillary. Okay. Now, again, this is, kind of getting nitpicky, and again, we're short on time, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but just realize that there are pressures that are pulling the blood, and so it's flowing. It's not getting stuck. It's continually moving. So hydrostatic pressure is also a force that we need to take into consideration. It's the physical force exerted against the surface by a liquid. We've already talked about blood pressure as an example of that. And so capillaries of the fluid that they are filtering, or the fluid that's moving through them, the capillaries are reabsorbing about 85% of that fluid. The other 15% is then absorbed by the lymphatic system and eventually returned to the blood. Okay, so this picture, I would encourage you to look at this picture a little closer in your textbook. It's going to be a little bit hard to see on this slide, but it shows that filtration is happening at the arterial end of the capillary, and then reabsorption is happening at the venous end. Now, in my opinion, that feels like a very short distance for all of this to be happening, but again, these pictures are showing a short little capillary. Well, it could be longer, and we're talking about tiny little molecules, so it's not too far-fetched to think that in that little section that filtration can happen at one end and reabsorption can happen at the other end. But again, I would take a closer look at a larger image of that picture so that you can kind of grasp what's happening at either end of the capillary. I would encourage you to watch this separately. And then this talks about some variations of that capillary filtration and reabsorption. So these are just talking about exceptions. And again, until we get to these, the respiratory system and the urinary system, that might not make a whole lot of sense, but there's some capillaries in the kidney that do not reabsorb, and some capillaries in the lungs that absorb completely. So a little bit different than your normal filtration at the arterial end and reabsorption at the venous end. Capillary activity varies from moment to moment, so it's not it varies. So we can talk about what is normally happening, but just realize that there is some variation. So the capillaries are collapsed in a resting tissue, and reabsorption is predominating. Whereas in active tissue, we would expect an increased blood flow through the capillaries and an increased blood pressure. When we have an accumulation of excess fluid in a tissue, that's an edema, and that occurs when the fluid is filtered into a tissue faster than it can be reabsorbed. And there's three basic causes for this to occur. That can be if the capillaries are increasing their filtration. It can also happen if the capillaries are not absorbing as much as they normally would. And then the other cause would be if there is obstructed lymphatic drainage. So we just said that 15% of the reabsorption or 15% of the fluid goes to the lymphatic system. Well, if that passage is obstructed, then the fluid would build up in the tissue. So all of these make sense. If the capillary is filtering more liquid than we would expect, then yeah, it's going to fill up in the tissue. If the capillary is not absorbing as much as we would expect, of course, you're going to have a buildup in the tissue. So each of these makes perfect sense. This talks about when that happens, kind of what our effects are. So if the tissue is full of fluid, the oxygen delivery and the waste removal are impaired. A pulmonary edema is when this occurs as a suffocation threat, or a cerebral edema is, of course, in the cerebrum, causing headaches, nausea, seizures, and possibly a coma. So if we get to a severe edema, this is where so much fluid in the tissue space causes low blood volume or low blood pressure. And so if there is not enough blood volume going through, then of course we have a severe case. I'm going to save this for the next video.